Okay, I think we are ready to start. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the panel called What if Western Balkans never becomes part of the European Union? My name is Dusan Gajic. I'm Europe correspondent for Radio Television of Serbia. I also run an independent production house called CTV, and I will have pleasure this afternoon to moderate the panel with this interesting and kind of provocative title. But I can assure you this will not be an improvised debate, because actually here with us we have four prominent researchers and think tankers from all over the Balkans who have taken time to reflect on this hypothetical or not hypothetical scenario that we will see during the debate, and to produce papers to develop arguments on possibilities if Balkans never becomes part of the EU. I should also say that the works of the people who are sitting here at the panel were selected as the most interesting and most relevant for this topic. So let's start by first introducing all of them to you. Starting from the other side of the panel, we have Mrs. Denisa Sarajlic, who is senior researcher for the Foreign Policy Initiative in Bosnia and Herzegovina. She works also as an independent consultant. She's a former Deputy Minister of Civil Affairs in Bosnia and Herzegovina, with extensive experience in working with international organizations, NGO sector, and in consulting. Next to her, Mr. Aleksandar Jovanovski, co-founder and a program coordinator for democracy and the rule of law at the European Policy Institute in Skopje. Between 2006 and 2011, he worked for the Secretariat for European Affairs of the government of the Republic of Macedonia, specifically on issues related to political criteria. Next to him, Mrs. Jovana Marovic is Executive Director of the Political Network, a think tank based in Podgorica. Jovana worked as a counselor for the European Union in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She's member of the Balkans in Europe Advisory Policy Group and the Working Group for Chapter 23 as part of the accession negotiations of Montenegro. Miloš Đinđić is a senior researcher and program manager for the Good Governance program of the European Policy Center, which is a Belgrade-based think tank. His policy research focuses on the implementation of frameworks for public administration reform, public financial management, public international financial control, and government accountability. Last but not least, next to me is Nikolaos Tsifakis, who is Assistant Professor of International Relations at the Department of Political Science and International Relations of the University of the Peloponnese in Greece. He's also Research Associate with the Wilfred Martens Center for European Studies. Like Mrs. Marovic, he's member of the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group, and his research focuses on international relations theory, EU external policies, and Balkan politics. Of course, I don't pretend that I exhausted everything they have done or are doing now. I should also say that Mr. Tsifakis has studied all the papers made by our panelists. He will comment on them later on, and of course on any other issue that might arise during the discussion. Going back to the title of the debate, What if Balkans never becomes part of the EU? You might ask yourself, well, what's the point of developing such a self-evidently negative scenario? But actually, when I was thinking about this before the panel, I think I realized that it's an interesting exercise to use this inverse logic to actually re-examine the real merits of the accession process, to ask some fundamental questions, to try to understand what's the purpose of everything, why we are doing, which direction the accession process should take us all, and can we really benefit from it. On the other hand, when you ask these questions, and when you can also ask yourself, is it really an imaginative scenario, or that's something that we are already living, actually. And you don't, as someone has put it, need a wild imagination to see what it means to be outside of the EU for the Balkan countries. Think just of the timeline in the last decade and more. It's now 14 years after Thessaloniki summit, when the European perspective was first pledged to the Balkan countries. It's 17 years now, almost a generation after the end of Balkan conflicts and the fall of Milosevic and so on, and the membership for Balkan countries is not really in sight. At the same time, as you all know, the EU in the meantime has changed profoundly, has gone through a series of crises and became less open and less appealing for potential members than it used to be. So knowing all this, it's probably no wonder that 33, if I'm not mistaken, % of citizens in Bosnia and Herzegovina and 38% of Serbian citizens believe that EU membership will never happen, actually, according to the latest Balkan Barometer survey. So if you would ask them, those citizens, instead of our panelists, I guess their answer would be, so what if Balkans never becomes part of the EU, because that's something we are already living. But nevertheless, I'm going to ask our panelists here to first do a quick round of short answers so that everybody could give his very short and sharp definition, what consequences for all of us and for the Western Balkans if it never joins the EU. So I would perhaps start with Mrs. Sarajlic.
Thank you, Dusan, and thank you all for attending this panel. As you just said, for citizens of all countries, EU membership already feels like a dystopian tale. And in line with the title of the conference itself, I tried to imagine the future of the Western Balkans outside the EU. And then I realized that we are in future, because back in 2003, in the Thessaloniki summit, everybody, or most people, strongly believed that by now our countries would be members of the European Union. So the question is, what happens, in fact, in this, what I would call post-future period, in the forthcoming period over the next 5 to 10 years? And if the Balkans is left out of the EU, what would that look like? And I think some of the regressive developments in individual countries in the region, some of the negative developments, which I will elaborate later on, basically give us a taste of what life would be like in the Western Balkans if it was left out of the European Union.
Okay.
I'll keep it to that for now.
Okay, we will later on have a chance to elaborate more arguments from your papers. But again, I would ask Mr. Jovanovski for a short headline. What if Balkans never becomes part of the EU?
Thank you, Dusan. Very similar to my colleague from Bosnia and Herzegovina. Exactly, I was in Thessaloniki when the Thessaloniki summit took place, and we were eager, and I was working in the secretariat back then, that by like in 10 years we will become members of the EU by 2013, but that never happened. And we should not go further imagining the scenario, because we are living the scenario. And that especially was the case with Macedonia. Until recently, we had a political crisis of 2 years that we were not able to solve ourselves, meaning that the capacity of the society to manage itself and to leverage itself was very, very low. Also, this vacuum of non-integration created political elites that were misusing the state resources and misusing the society to fulfill their own political agenda, thus creating divisions among political lines, ethnic lines, that can be seen, as I said, in the Macedonian case. But also, one positive note that I can mention as a food for thought is the strengthening of the civil society, especially in Macedonia. Because without the civil society, especially the colorful revolution, the protests of the students, and especially the emergence of think tanks, we would be not able to discuss about rule of law, democracy, and so on. So I will stop at this moment and I will elaborate further.
Okay, thank you. We will continue later. So switching to Jovana Marovic, again, the same question. What if, is it really a hypothetical scenario or we already live it?
Well, even though I'm pessimistic about the current state of play between the EU and the Western Balkans, I'm not that much pessimistic about life without the EU, or to be more precise about full membership into the EU. If not the EU, the second best option is a flexible Europe or a flexible approach to the integration process. That means that the Western Balkan countries still have signed and ratified the Stabilization Association Agreement with the European Union, and this is somehow framework for democratization and for the reforms, economic and political too. So basically, if European Union is now trying to find solution for the crisis within the EU with the multi-speed Europe, this could be one kind of sector-by-sector integration of the Western Balkans.
Okay, thanks. Same question for Milos.
Thank you, Dusan. Can you hear me? Yeah. As you mentioned at the beginning, actually the question, what if we never become members, we have to answer the previous question is why we are pursuing EU membership in the first place. Because I think that answer to this question is giving us, let's say, more meat for the further debate. Because just to put it simply at the beginning, if the ultimate goal of the accession process was to become EU member, then absence of EU membership perspective would mean basically that, we didn't achieve it, and we stop with what we have done so far, and this is basically the end of the story. If the ultimate goal of the accession process was to have a proper reform in our countries for the purpose of the, well, at least theoretically speaking, for the purpose of the well-being of the citizens, for better and stronger institutions, then even if this membership perspective is prolonged to an indefinite period of time with no end in sight, or even if this perspective is suspended, then we can keep the pace of these exact same reforms because we know what are the standards and requirements from the EU accession process. We in the civil society. And exactly here, as Aleksandar mentioned, civil society actors, local actors at national level and at the regional level, which is I think more important here, even here more important, can play a significant role. But I can elaborate on this a bit further when we do a second round. Yeah.
Nicholas, I would pass the same question to you. You have perhaps a different perspective on this.
Technically speaking, the prospect of EU accession is real. Juncker recently mentioned, President of the European Commission, Juncker, a nominative date of 2025. So technically speaking, everything is in process. But we are leaving the stop or the end of the EU accession if we think so. And this is what has happened in the region since 2009 when leaderships have abandoned the reform agenda and when societies recently have become increasingly Eurosceptic and have lost faith in the fulfillment of the process. So while the process advances, this stagnation of the last 5-6 years have given us a small image, a view of how things will look if EU accession does not advance.
Okay, thanks. Now we will have time to develop arguments from the papers of the panelists here. I should just remind everybody that there is a time limit, so we should stick to that. But of course, there will be time afterwards for questions and to come back to all issues that have perhaps not been raised in the first round of the panel. So turning back to Denisa again, I think you, in your paper about possible non-membership of the Balkans, have reminded about Europe as a peace project and the importance of that dimension. So is that actually the main value of Europe for Balkan countries?
Well, thank you, Dusan. I think it's good to start from that conclusion specifically because it's my main conclusion, that the EU needs to be reminded that why it was established in the first place, and that it was established for the purpose of maintaining peace on the continent. And maybe now is a good time to rethink the European Union from that perspective and see it as again as a peace-building or peacekeeping project in the case of the Western Balkans, because I'm going to outline some 6 developments which I think are already happening in countries of the region, which point in the direction of the greater likelihood of renewed conflicts in case we don't actually enter the European Union. The first one is democratic backsliding, which we are witnessing in quite a few countries of the region, and I think it's quite obvious what's been happening: reform, stalemate, state capture, political crisis, obstructive individuals, corruption, divisive rhetoric, etc. And what we would be witnessing in the forthcoming period, unless membership becomes offered more concretely, is basically amplification and intensification of those regressive tendencies. Another thing that's happening sort of under the umbrella of democratic backsliding is the loss of popular faith in democracy. People are not only losing faith in the EU and the membership of the EU, but they're actually losing faith in democracy as a framework for our societies. And the way I see it is that the EU framework is a scaffolding of values which should hold democratic systems throughout Europe, but specifically in Western Balkans. And if you remove this scaffolding, what you're left with is a very frail construction which hasn't been built properly and which is not finished yet. And there's a risk of this structure collapsing if you remove or if you weaken the scaffolding of the European values. The second set of developments, which again, we don't need to be very creative about what would happen in future. These are the things that are happening already now, is the role of external role models, which in many cases are not necessarily democratic and are illiberal. And we only have to see what's been happening here in Belgrade, in this hotel, over the past couple of days to understand what these tendencies are. The absence of the EU as this kind of ideological framework of values would create a political and ideological vacuum and void, which could then be filled by external actors. What would be their motivations in the Balkans? Well, basically, they want to undermine the European Union, and the Western Balkans is a perfect terrain for external actors like Turkey, Russia, and even China to undermine the European Union. The third important development is the decline of political structures and decline of parties and party structures. I think we're already witnessing, and I can speak specifically of Bosnia and Herzegovina, some of the corroding of structures of political parties. There's no appetite for consensus or for compromising, and the style of politics is basically this antagonistic, conflictual style which have been seen for a couple of decades now. And the parties, the main parties, the nationalist parties, the biggest parties would tend then to create an illusion of multi-party systems, whereas in fact smaller parties and more liberal parties would disappear basically from the political scene over time. The fourth tendency or the fourth development is the opening or reopening of border issues, which would be fed by the secessionist appetites, which are already rising, and also the unresolved border issues within the region. The fifth development would be increasing or pressure on independent actors in civil society, media, specific individuals. We have already seen some of this in Macedonia, in Bosnia, in Serbia to a certain extent, and we have to remind ourselves, and especially to remind the European Union, that the rise, which is populism, which is on the rise in the European Union, is not new to us in the Balkans. We invented it. We invented it. This is our thing, which the European Union is only experiencing now. However, the rising populism in the European Union could be used to legitimize the populist tendencies and the nationalist politics within the region. And this is the danger that is, in fact, coming to the region from the European Union. And the sixth development is the reversal of the EU-sponsored reforms. And I think from the EU's perspective, this is possibly the most dangerous or directly dangerous development that could unfold. This is already happening in the area of rule of law and judiciary. However, where it would sort of spill over or have a spillover effect towards the EU is in softer issues like environment, human rights, but also border management or control of the borders, cross-border crimes, human trafficking, etc. And I know this is not funny, but I still have to sort of say it. Most of you know the joke that when the Europeans come to the Balkans and we say to them, "Welcome to the Balkans, your car is already here," alluding to the crimes, selling the cars which have been imported to the Balkans. I think this might change, and if the Balkans ever comes to the European Union could say to the Balkans, "Welcome to the European Union, your citizens are already here." We have striking figures about the exodus, especially of young people, to countries of the European Union and even further away. And this is something that is, again, already happening as a result of our countries not being part of the European Union, and this is going to change and intensify. So just, I mean, we're probably going to have a chance to speak more about the conclusion, but just let me throw a few remarks.
Please briefly, yes.
It is true, as we've heard over and over again over the past 2 days, that the EU is facing internal crises with the migration and the financial crisis and populism, the rise of populism. But it would be a mistake to leave the Western Balkans on its own or outside the EU while the EU sorts itself out. There needs to be a framework, some kind of framework. I don't want to throw too many ideas now, and we can talk about this later. But the Western Balkans is always a potentially much bigger crisis for the European Union than on any or all of the crises which it is experiencing at the moment. We must not forget that. The potency of the Western Balkans as a place of renewed conflict is something that the EU always needs to bear in mind. So what the EU should possibly do is to recontextualize the Western Balkans in the light of the EU as it is today, because the EU is clearly different now than it was in Thessaloniki. And from that perspective, then provide some kind of prospect for the Western Balkans so that it doesn't remain, the membership doesn't remain this dystopian tale for citizens of the Western Balkans. The other tactics which is not working for the Western Balkans is this idea that if the European Union keeps the Western Balkans too busy, then this is how we are going to avoid conflicts or escalation of any kind. This is not working because the process of approximating the EU or the process of accession is clearly proving too demanding for the weak states of the Western Balkans. So there needs to be some kind of rethinking whether this process is not delivering, not only because the countries and the governments of the Western Balkans are not delivering, but maybe also because the process itself is not fit for the purpose. So in the end, I'll just say, as Dusan pointed out, that yes, the EU is a peace building or peacekeeping project, but it is not a conflict prevention mechanism. So we need to bear in mind that we heard quite a lot about this yesterday, in which ways the EU is not good at preventing conflicts or even stopping conflicts, and I think we from Bosnia still bear deep scars from that experience. So we shouldn't even put ourselves or put the region in a situation where it is in a state of conflict and where it has the EU as a conflict prevention actor, because it is quite unlikely that this would be detrimental both to the region and to the European Union.
Okay, thank you. Obviously, it doesn't look like a very positive scenario, the sort of permanent lack of, potential permanent lack of European perspective for the Balkan countries, as the Balkans would lose this external dimension, external pressure and push factor for necessary reforms. But Aleksandar, are we so dependent on the external pressure to do what we are supposed to do?
To answer you right now, yes, we are dependent, unfortunately. And one portion of my paper I've dedicated to analyzing why we are still so dependent on intervention from third sides, especially EU. And that was quite evident in resolving the Macedonian crisis, as well as what was happening in Albania. The political parties in the parliament, you can see that the EU plays a strong role in mediating the development of the relations between Serbia and Kosovo, and also quite present in Bosnia and Herzegovina with large-scale EU projects on development of EU integration structure and so on. But to return to my central argument in the paper, last year, because I'm seeing Srđan here, I'm inspired by you, because last year, if you remember, we went to Brussels. I was from EPI, we have Institut Alternativa, and we had the Belgrade Center for Security Policy to lobby in Brussels to present our cases. So luckily, the colleagues from Montenegro and Serbia had something to say, even though they were quite critical of the developments in their own country. But when it came for me to represent the Macedonian case towards DG NIR, I was so disappointed and desperate to find arguments to say why we want to join the European Union. So that's why I want to reverse now the argument. Since then, we made a large-scale research from 3 countries, Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia, and we analyzed what are the pending issues of the society. As you asked, what are the pending issues of the citizens? What they understand, what is democracy, what is rule of law, what is reform of the judiciary. And when you see the results are not promising. They're not tangible. They cannot touch those kind of reforms. And for us, people that are advocating for European integration and working on European integration, is becoming difficult to advocate for this issue. But when we were asked in Brussels, like, why are you doing this? The answer was, if we are not doing this, who will do it? Because the citizens need to know about the reforms, the content of the reforms, but not for the sake of the EU. And that's also the second argument that I explored in the paper. All those reforms are in line for further democratization and development of our countries. When we are talking about judiciary, we should always connect that judiciary it's a mechanism that protects your right. It protects your privacy, going back to the wiretapping scandal that happened in Macedonia. And it enables for economic development. It enables for protection of property rights and so on. But also, this kind of vacuum that was created in the last period can be reflected in the same problems that we are having. The research that we produced showed that 90% of the problems are pretty much the same. In order to test, we made an experiment in EPI. We took the countries out and we divided the problems, meaning backsliding in judiciary, backsliding in human rights, I don't know, police brutality, police intervention, and so on. And we asked people that are working in academia and in media to select the problems to the country they think that most represent. And when we analyze the results, you can see that everything was wrong, but the problems, for example, something that was typical for Macedonia, they thought was typical for Montenegro. Something that was typical for Montenegro was also deemed typical for Serbia. And by this, we concluded that the problems are pretty much the same, without even asking how they perceive and how they interpret European integration with that context. Also, we managed to create very strong political parties. I will not say political parties, but strong executives, meaning that the political life of the country is run by the party. And that made some negative results, negative tendencies, and that was quite evident in Skopje when we realized that there have been systematic violation of rule of law issues. Just to circle around the argument, when we realized that we have a systematic violation of rule of law, the political parties asked for mitigation by the European Union to resolve the crisis, and we entered into a cycle of never-ending negotiations between the opposition and the position back then. Even though it was much more dramatic in Macedonia, the same model then was applied in Montenegro, when members from the opposition entered the government in order to mitigate the entire situation. And by this, we are seeing that we are still in the demand of intervention. We are still in the demand of assistance by the European Union. And to answer the panel, what if we never enter the European Union? The perspective is not that good. We are seeing that this scenario, the worst case scenario, is actually the worst case scenario, because as the colleagues from Bosnia said, we are having very dire statistics. We are having outflow of young people, and by some estimates from the World Bank that I've read, 400,000 people from Macedonia left the country in the past 10 years, which is something that is of utmost importance, not only for the country, also for the region and also for the European Union, because those people are moving to the countries of the European Union. Just to finalize for this section of my presentation, because I've mentioned civil society. Civil society is getting a momentum right now, and we are seeing this by the increased capacities of think tanks, of organizations that are advocating for European integration to network. Because we are sitting here, these are my friends, I'm seeing these guys like every month, if not every 2 weeks, because we realize that we have to advocate for the common agenda, not for the national agenda. Of course, we are organizing this kind of nice events, we are speaking to conferences, we are presenting our papers, but I think that one of the positive things, because I want to end on a positive note, is that the realization of some sector of the society that by joint advocacy activities and by joint work and joint exploration of the problems, we are becoming stronger, and we are presenting much more stronger case at the national level, and also at Brussels level. And I think it's the way forward, because now we are speaking in a same voice, demanding rule of law, demanding reforms, demanding dismantling this connection between the party and the state, and so on.
Thank you very much. Please bear in mind that you will have time again when we go to questions to make other points that you maybe didn't have time to make now. Jovana, in your paper, I think beyond discussing the situation in the Balkans, you have touched also upon the situation and the developments in the European Union and the importance of what's going on there for what might happen in our region.
Yes, but first of all, why we are talking about what if we never join the EU? First of all, there is, of course, apathy in our countries, within the citizens and also within the government, even though there are some, let's say, optimistic statements regarding the last Juncker's announcement about the possible date for joining of Montenegro and Serbia to the EU. I think that the first reason, of course, is what is happening within our countries. A lack of democracy, lack of commitment to the European integration process. In Montenegro, for example, our political elite or let's say ruling party is using this rhetoric of commitment to the European integration process just for gaining political points and votes, and of course, DPS in Montenegro is using another mechanisms such as employment in public administration and then allocation of social assistance, also misuse of public funds for party purposes, also clientelism network, corruption, and many other mechanisms. But what is the difference between Montenegro and the other Western Balkan countries? We don't have illiberal tendencies. This is a trend in Montenegro for 30 years or 27 years, because we have same government for 27 years. So basically, Democratic Party of Socialists in Montenegro has much more time to develop such mechanisms, and that's the main, problem, how to actually make this government democratic one, and how to force the reforms, and how to the problem is with the negotiation process with the EU in Montenegro. It's about technical progress. It's about this, how to say, institutional or technical approach from the EU. And the second one is actually that the ruling party and the government is not ready actually to implement this painful reform, such as public administration reform and the other. The problem is also that we have some kind of progress in the negotiations, and but the forceful legislative activity or improved legislation does not mean the rule of law. The second thing is that the greater transparency and also improved procedures for the civil society involvement do not mean that we actually have chance to improve legislation and to improve procedures in Montenegro. And speaking about the EU's position towards the Western Balkans, the first problem is actually that EU has its own problems, its lack of democracy at supranational level, the level of member states, and it's also a problem with migration and Brexit and many other issues. And that's why EU is not devoted actually to solve problems within the Western Balkans. But the second issue is also that EU is trying to fill this gap between the announcements from the European Commission and EU officials that there will be no enlargement for 4 years, for 8 years now, and something they are trying to formulate new instruments such as Berlin process, and then the initiative for the regional economic area, and then this new one about and the strategy on successful accession of the Serbia and Montenegro to the EU. The problem is that we still don't see real benefits of such initiatives. The problem is that we don't see what new EU can say in this strategy for successful accession to the EU. If we have conditionality policy, if we have this framework for negotiations, why do we need new document actually to define something new and something important for this time framework? The problem is that we will have not just the backsliding of democracy, we will have stagnation of efforts to do anything during the next 3 or 4 years. Our authorities and our officials will wait for the new European Commission actually to start something new to do or to work on. And this is also a problem for the civil society and the initiatives coming from civil society, because we already actually highlighted problems within the system, and now it's a problem that we have to repeat it over and over again, because nothing new is happening within the country. And why I'm saying that there is a solution and it's not like pessimistic one regarding what if we never become part of the EU. The solution is actually that we still have stabilization and association agreements, that there are some obligations for Western Balkan countries and even for the EU. We have to report to the EU regarding the progress in fulfillment of criteria from the Stabilization and Association Agreement. And actually, why I'm saying that the EU have to stay at the Western Balkans, because of this concern for stability, because they have obligations according to these plans, as I said, and for some reason, one of the instruments at the EU level that they want to implement now as a dominant approach is this multi-speed Europe, which actually means that they will somehow offer to the member states to integrate in the areas that they want. Using this approach, I think that there is a scope also to integrate Western Balkan countries in the same way, to go sector by sector, first economy and then trade and the other chapters. We have criteria, we have this obligation from the EU to be there and to monitor reforms. And just using this language from the EU level, Western Balkans are already in the widest cycle of integration. I'm not using this parallel from the Dante's novel, because we will be at the first or second cycle, but we are already in the last circle of integration regarding economy, regarding the trade, regional cooperation. So I think there is a hope that this should be one of the possible scenarios if we will not be part of the EU.
Okay, thank you. Milos, in your paper, you focused on the sector of public administration reform in trying to answer, from that perspective, what if Balkans never becomes part of the EU?
Well, as we all know, the question of the European future of the Western Balkan states can, get pretty political or technical. So let's speak a bit more of this technical side of the accession process. So, as a case in point, in our paper, we took public administration reform. So, just as an introduction to the answer to the question of the paper, or let's say the main argument, I would just do the little bit of a timelining of administrative reforms in the Western Balkan countries, because we are all facing similar challenges, and we have basically PAR as reform on the agenda in the States. So there is no European Union acquis on the public administration reform. There is no specific chapter to negotiate. But still, PAR is one of the three fundamentals in the accession process as defined by the European Commission. Okay. So besides rule of law, and so kind of it has the same importance as two other pillars or fundamentals. Despite having no negotiation chapter on this, there are standards defined by the Commission and the OECD. Program Sigma is doing the assessment, monitors the progress. These reports feed into the Commission's reports, and we, from time to time, get some sort of a state of the play of how are we performing in the area of public administration reform. In parallel to this, over time, the European Commission has become the largest supporter, let's say, in financial terms of the civil society in the Western Balkans. So if you look at the figures over time, you will see that there is a significant or mention-worthy, should I say, involvement of the European Commission, European Union in general, to support development of civil society through different means. Basically, it started more or less with internal capacity building, then with creating an enabling environment for the CSO, and later on, the EC focused more on the state civil society relations. So basically, civil society as a whole in the Western Balkans have been supported to contribute to the reforms in any of the areas of these three fundamentals that we have. So rule of law, economic governance, and public administration reform. And the question would be, if for any reason we lose basically membership perspective, and on the other hand, there has been so much investment on the part of the administration, the EU, the civil society to fulfill the requirements these reforms require, does this need to mean that we have to abandon all that we have, contributed to this process? So this is really the big question, because if there is no other viable alternative in terms of integration to a different organization, let's say international, regional, or so on, it means that reforms that are most of the times, many authors argue, and I'm personally of this opinion myself, these reforms are pushed by the external conditionality, so as a way of, let's say, policy conditionality or general EU accession conditionality. But if we decide to give away what we have done so far in this whole process, it would mean dissipating of time, of resources. We are basically putting a halt on these processes just somewhere in the middle, more or less. So this is why the main argument of our paper says civil society at the level of the Western Balkans, in all its diversity and with different focus in terms of activities, so think tanks, watchdogs, popular movements, and so on, have ultimately the same goal, let's say, and this is, as I said, better institutions, more rule of law, more democracy, but different means. And since this is a panel of think tanks, one way to build this demand for reforms, irrespective of the EU accession, EU membership perspective, basically, is to work together at the level of a region to provide evidence and to advocate before national authorities for the continuation of the reforms, even if we, let's say, don't become members in the next decades or whatsoever. This would require, of course, this is not an easy task, and it requires capacity building and awareness raising, doing the policy research, doing the advocacy, but this is actually happening right now, as Aleksandar mentioned. Would it be hard to do it without the EU external conditionality? It would, but there is I think, at least if there is a spark of enthusiasm within the civil society, that we can be the ones who can contribute to maintain the pressure for public administration reform. In this case, this is the topic of our paper, this is already the way forward. And just to mention that this is already reality, we are together in the European Policy Center, together with our colleagues, are having this initiative of regional monitoring and advocacy for power in the Western Balkans through the Weber project. But not only that, you have other initiatives such as advocacy initiatives for the European integration of the Western Balkans, such as WB6. So civil society saw actually that there is a potential in being together and creating regional peer pressure and doing regional advocacy, because combining all voices of the civil society together in this region where we face similar problems and perhaps we need similar solutions is one way to go forward.
Okay, so locally driven reforms as a potential substitute for external conditionality. Nikolaos, you had the pleasure to study all those arguments by our panelists, so what did you make out of it?
Thank you. I indeed had the privilege to read the full papers and to see how these arguments that they were very briefly presented here were developed. All papers were very interesting, they were short, smartly written, and they managed with, although they had exactly the same set of questions, to raise different issues and somehow remain complementary. What I did not find anywhere is second order questions. For instance, if the Western Balkans do not accede to the EU, this is not one scenario, this is a series of scenarios. And to give an example, the question is, will the NATO accession of the region advances? In that case, you may worry for the Turkey scenario that you raised, that most of you raised, in the case of all Western Balkan countries minus Serbia. And in Serbia's case, you may worry much more for Belarus, or not to mention the Ukraine scenario. So the NATO accession is a fundamental variable that was not touched upon. And this is because if they are part of the Western security community, they are less, as Denisa mentioned, liable or vulnerable to the Russian influence. Still, all the democratic problems that have been mentioned will be there. Another second-order question is, what if not all countries accede to the EU? And this is a very highly likely scenario. We see that Montenegro advances, we see that Serbia keeps up, but we don't have the same feeling about Bosnia or Kosovo. What will happen if, let's say, these two still potential candidate member states never accede? Will there just be black holes in the region or sources of instability for the EU members that may be Serbia, for instance? And this is an intermediate scenario which is very likely as far as the progress in the EU accession process is not linear, and they are not expected all countries being ready at the same moment. Several things that have been touched upon by all of the speakers, and I'll just tell them as headlines, is the democratic backsliding, the lack of progress in the law of sector reforms, the lack of ownership of reforms, and the procedural, so far, advancement in the accession process. I'll make very brief comments in this paper. I will avoid repeating what has been said so far, but just highlight parts that maybe were not mentioned or I found worth repeating. In Denisa's paper, there is a fear or a concern about the increased role of Russia and Turkey. I think that the reach of both of these countries is very limited. Russia's reach is exhausted in Serbia and the Republika Srpska, and Turkey's only in the Bosniak is manifested only in the Bosniak politics and personally over the party of Izetbegovic. It is overestimated, this influence, and also we should keep in mind that the Russian and the Turkish policies in the region are contradictory on important questions such as the Kosovo question or the Bosnian question. So there are fundamental differences between these two actors, and we should not so much overestimate their role. You mentioned somewhere, will NATO accession be possible without the EU accession of the Western Balkans? So far, it has been the other way around. NATO accession precedes EU accession. So this is not going to be an obstacle, but I mentioned what it may imply such a scenario. And it is very important to keep here last comment at the end, that reforms which had a high political cost are the most vulnerable to be removed, to be dismantled if the EU accession process is stopped. And this is a very important comment. In the paper of Aleksandar, he highlights a paradox. The paradox is that since 2011, the European Commission has prioritized reforms in the areas of the judiciary, in the protection of fundamental rights, in the fight against corruption. At the same moment, this focus of the European Commission on these reforms has been followed by total lack of progress in the rule of law reforms. So while the European Commission has prioritized these policy areas, we see a stagnation in the reform process. Aleksandar raised the question of the ownership of reforms and the need to engage more closely the civil society in monitoring the EU accession process, in being part in this process. Absent the, as he explains, absent the EU accession perspective, the Western Balkan candidates should still try to improve conditions in their countries for the sake of their citizens. Giovanna's paper has a very interesting idea worth exploring. She's thinking that if the EU accession process does not advance, as we're seeing it now, that we may advance from one sector to another, follow a sectoral approach, follow a functional approach in the EU enlargement. What is very interesting in this idea is that anyhow the EU enlargement is deficient in benchmarks. It has not rewards before the end of the process. We found one which was the visa waiver, the visa liberalization, and has been beneficial for the region. So if we take your idea of a sectoral integration, moving from one sector of the economy, of one policy to another, and we put it into practice, irrespective of whether the EU enlargement will advance, we may end up finding interim benchmarks, interim rewards to the Western Balkan candidates who know that they should pass through painful reforms and see at the end of the day the whole reward come in one piece, which is the full membership. Finally, the paper of Milos has a very specific topic. It focuses on the public administration reform. He very rightly points out that there is no acquis, and this is strange. It's interesting because the public administration is what concerns the public administration is the efficiency of a state. If we have inefficient state structures, we can't expect any reform to take place. But and this is a key point. And anyhow, although there is no acquis, the EU enlargement has been beneficial to the countries by the transfer of expertise of funds who has helped the improvement of the capacity of the state structures. Again here, much like Aleksandar, they end up with the same conclusion that we need the local ownership of reforms, and the end of the process should not or any stagnation of the process should not imply that the things will get worse on this field. As a final concluding remark, of course, the question that is discussed in this session is about the external driver of reforms in the area. And as it has been pointed out by all four speakers, this external driver is very important, is motivating change. Still, recent experience in the EU, and I'm thinking of the Orban scenario, tell us that the EU accession will not render any candidate, any country, immune to such a perspective. Or to put it differently, the EU membership should not be automatically or unquestionably linked to democratic consolidation. At the end of the day, the countries should do their own homework, even after, in the post-accession period, and not consider that this procedural compliance with, by ticking the box on several requirements is sufficient for their democratic consolidation.
Thank you very much, Nikolaos, for highlighting all the points that could be found in the papers made by our panelists. You mentioned that the question of the panel could be actually a series of scenarios. I could add one and ask a question: what if Western Balkans becomes member of the EU, the countries become member of the EU, but without doing all necessary reforms and perhaps not achieving sustainable changes in the areas such as rule of law? That could be also a potential scenario, as we see that transformative power of the accession is not always obvious and not always present as we perhaps believed it would be. But now it's high time to open the floor for some questions. So please, if you would like to address our panelists, feel free. Okay, there is one question there. It's coming.
Hello, thank you. I'm Kurt Bassiner from the Democratization Policy Council and also University of St. Andrews. A lot of you touched on this point, so let me offer an observation to precede my question. I mean, it seems, the EU was a peace project, but it developed itself in a conducive environment under an American nuclear umbrella. The security question was initially not the EU's bailiwick, because there was external provision of that. And initially, after the wars here in this region, there was a presumption of external security provision, which has waned, in part because I think the EU's presumption that we were beyond needing that, but also the presumption that it had partners in each of these governments that meant what they said, that they actually wanted to join the club and meet the conditions and all that. And we've seen demonstration over the past decade that that's not so, that they don't mean what they say. But that's never been really revisited and confronted. So effectively what you have toward the region now is what amounts to a containment policy. Stability über alles, throw money at it, and the relation of the EU to citizens, and the West as well, my own country as well, but we're following the EU lead in the Western Balkans, is look at what all the EU could do for you. It's always sort of presented in a money terms and prosperity terms. Values are not really front and center in the approach. And so those of you who are exponents of liberal democratic values and practices and procedures, at least in my observation, have been left hanging by the people who are supposedly, that should be on your side, in favor of the supposed partners in the leadership level in these governments. And that has discredited the European project at a popular level. So my question really is it the membership perspective or the proximity of membership perspective that's the real problem, or is it the EU's posture and approach to your countries that is the more damaging issue in terms of being able to embed democratic practice and reform?
Okay, there was another question I saw there, so maybe we take two. Yes, please.
Thank you very much to the panelists. I'm Philip Cunliffe from the University of Kent. Listening to what everyone has said, I just want to put the question to the panelists whether or not it was a mistake for liberal reformers, for civil society groups, for governments who were reformist governments. Was it a mistake for them to root so many of their hopes on this external guidance and to become so dependent on external support for their projects of democratization, liberalization, and reform, and that perhaps that need for external independence has led to the kinds of problems that the panelists have identified?
Okay, perhaps one more. Yes, the lady there.
Hello, I'm Penelope Angelopoulos from the Government of Canada. I have a question that's a bit of a different lens. Earlier last year, President Putin's party had suggested that there should be, instead of EU membership, there should be a union of non-aligned countries in the Western Balkans. And earlier this year, we had suggestions of a little union between Albania and Kosovo. So I wonder if any of the panelists have thought about alternative suggestions or possibilities of unification for Western Balkans should EU accession not happen. Thank you.
Okay, so let's maybe now answer to some questions. First two, in my understanding, were kind of similar. The role of EU in democratization and the role of accession process, and the dependency on to achieve reforms. So I don't know who feels inspired to offer an answer. Aleksandar?
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Both, and the third question, very, very interesting and relevant, because first I want to reflect on the question asked by the gentleman there. It's both. You ask whether it's the proximity to the European Union or whether it's the leverage or the demand for reforms. It's the both, because sometimes it's very difficult to sell EU reform in the country because they're expensive, and they have political expenses, they have financial implication, and so on and so on. Because regardless of the EU, some reforms will happen, but the membership to the EU demands much more that a country can bear. And without a set of date, the country cannot mobilize its internal resources, meaning the administration, putting the administration in place to deliver upon results, also to mobilize the parliament, meaning that laws has to be passed, laws has to be discussed in the parliament, and so on, and then communicating to the public, because the public then has to approve on the referendum whether the country wants to join the European Union. So the proximity is needed to mobilize internal resources to deliver upon reforms. But most importantly, as I argued in my paper, the ownership of the reform, it's up to the country, because we should stop selling those reforms as EU-demanded reforms. Democracy is not EU-demanded. Democracy is something that we want to have for our own society. Then, just to reflect to the question to the gentleman at the back, my answer is very similar that I gave, meaning that for the issue of leverage is something that I always want to discuss, because we can see that in the past few years, the EU lost its leverage in the region, meaning that the governments can deliver something, they can mimic reforms, They can sell technical reforms to Brussels just by ticking boxes, and then the Brussels in the progress reform for the sake of the relationship with the country and for the sake of stability, because they are still treating the Western Balkans as an unstable region. They will say, okay, some progress has been made, and then it's up for our organizations to, in a way, defend the position of the Union, meaning that we are more Catholic than the Pope itself. So it's a paradox, and hopefully I think that this situation will change, but also reflecting on what Miloš said, in a way we are becoming the voice that previously was voiced by the European Union, by experts demanding reforms. We know what has to be delivered, to be honest. We know what has to be delivered.
Okay.
And on the issue of rearranging the Balkans, I don't know, I will not comment on that.
Anyone else on these questions, also on the potential new unions in the Balkans?
Well, I'd also prefer not to comment on that. I mean, it's kind of beyond this discussion, and it opens up a whole new discussion. Although it's a legitimate question, but it's kind of too sensitive as well. But let me address the other two questions in reverse order. First, the question about dependence on the external actor for democratization. There's two sides to that coin, obviously. On one hand, the EU hasn't really been a real democratizer in that sense. It's acted more as a bureaucratic power rather than a normative power that should be an external democratizer. On the other hand, the political leadership and in the Western Balkans and the political elites have really just paid lip service to democratization and to the EU accession more generally. So they're not actually dependent. They are just using the EU accession as a cover-up to keep the status quo and to enjoy all the benefits of being under the status quo. To answer Kurt's question, actually I agree with Aleksandar, it's both. The problem is whether there's going to be membership in the first place and the proximity of membership. I don't think, in spite the Thessaloniki, in spite all the declarations and in spite all these declarations on the part of the political elites in the Balkans that they remain committed to the European accession, that could even count as prospect of membership. We shouldn't be misguided by false declarations. We shouldn't even be misguided by the written declarations that we have. We need a framework. We need dates, we need promises, we need structures, we need engagement, not only through the government and political elites, but through independent actors, civil society, but even more importantly, this is something that Ambassador Schäfer said in his panel, we need to change the context. None of this will matter if we don't change the context, both within the Balkans, but within the EU itself as well. And we need to broaden the discussion to what is is there a fertile ground for any of these reforms and demands which the EU is putting before our countries. So it's possibly even a more demanding, I would say, process than the accession itself. It's about changing mindsets, it's about changing context, and it's about engaging a much, much wider circle of actors.
Okay, obviously new dynamics and new structures are needed. I saw Mr. Svoboda was asking for a question. It's coming.
More this question of sectoral approach, because having observed now the enlargement, or say the non-enlargement process in the Balkans, and having been rapporteur for Croatia, I see the despair of many people in the region that it is not going on. And of course there are many mistakes done homemade here. But one of the sectoral approach could be, for example, security. I don't mean security which was discussed in the morning with NATO, but cyber security issues, radicalization even of a very small number of young people, security issues in connection with migration, border control. If you see how between Croatia and Slovenia this border issue has propped up. So I think some sort of EU Balkan security common space, there are other elements of it. But I think we have to break down or break through this stalemate we have between, yes, always the discussion, you have to do your job, no, but the EU have to respond. We have to have very concrete steps, intermediate steps, which are leading towards integration, but not yet the full integration. I think this sectoral approach should be really elaborate much more, and we should not have fears. The Russians are coming, the Turks are coming, and we don't do anything from the EU side together with the region. So I think I just wanted to support and underline that would be an extremely valuable work on the sectoral approach going towards full integration in steps.
Thank you. Any other questions? There is a question over there.
Hello, Cosmin Denisa from University of Bucharest and New Strategy Center. On a very pragmatic note, obviously, because you were talking about pragmatism of the EU and, well, the challenges of the EU, I would like to pose a question to Denisa, because I was following your discourse with a lot of interest. You were saying that the Western Balkans is probably the biggest issue that the EU has at the moment. But again, on a very pragmatic note, I've been to Ukraine 2 weeks ago, and they were saying that Ukraine is the biggest issue that the EU has at the moment. So what actually makes the Western Balkans the biggest issue of the EU at the moment? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Denisa, would you like to?
Microphone not working. Is the microphone working? Yeah. Very quickly, I did not say that the Balkans is now the biggest issue the EU is working. What I'm saying is, if there are new conflicts in the Western Balkans in future, that in itself would be a much bigger crisis than anything the EU is facing today. I'm not saying it's currently the biggest problem.
Okay, I guess we have still a couple of minutes before we finish. There is one more question. Yes.
Thank you, Brian Hebel, Embassy of Canada. The question before us is, what if the Western Balkans never becomes part of the EU? And this question has been interpreted as, what does the EU mean for the Western Balkans? What are the implications for the Western Balkans if the Western Balkans don't join the EU? I suggest that maybe we should turn that question around. We shouldn't be asking, what will the Western Balkans do for you, or sorry, what will the European Union do for you, but what you can do for the European Union. The European Union already is faced with a number of problems achieving internal coherence and coordination. Given the slow pace of reform and the slow pace of EU accession of the countries of the Western Balkans, what do you think are the main strengths that the Western Balkans would bring to the European Union?
Well, that's a fair point. Jovana, would you like to address it?
No, I just wanted to address a previous question regarding the... Okay, but you said if someone wants to add something regarding the previous questions. The first comment is regarding the sector-by-sector integration. I think that the formula is the same as the start of the European integration itself, because they started sector regarding the cooperation still and community and everything, and they, after all, failed to integrate itself within the political sensitive issues regarding the common foreign and security policy and many other issues. So basically, when they started to improve democracy in the European Union at the EU level, the problems at that time, at that stage, actually started to raise. The second issue is regarding the local ownership of the reforms. I think that the main issue is actually that civil society in Western Balkans is still waiting for the EU to be judged regarding our recommendations and our proposals and our initiatives. We are waiting because our proposals in our countries are refused without proper explanation. We are participating in the working groups, even in the negotiating working groups in Montenegro. We are participating in the monitoring teams and at many other levels. We are part of the public consultations on a regular basis, but the problem is that actually we don't have influence on the public policy and legislation in Montenegro. So basically we are still waiting for the EU to evaluate our proposals and to be interested in our proposals, and that's the mistake. And also we are somehow our proposals are directed to the decision makers, because usually we are preparing proposals how to improve public policy, and they are the one which are adopting such and these instruments and legislation. And somehow I think that our target group should be and have to be at a local, and that our address are citizens, and that the change has to be different logic to go from the citizens, and that we have to influence them to produce change.
Okay, would someone like to pick up on the point of the gentleman? What's the added value of Balkans in the EU?
Yeah. I want to start a marketing and saying, this is what they will add. For me, it's a purely political question. It is a question of credibility. If you have get engaged in the region for the last 20 years with tremendous amount of money, with peacekeepers, with diplomacy, and this is as once Chancellor Schroeder said, a place only an hour away flight from many European capitals. And if you cannot deliver results there, then the whole EU idea as an international actor is void of meaning. So it's a question of credibility once you have started this process, that you deliver results. And this is more important than that what will bring Montenegro or Kosovo to the EU in terms of diversity or resources or anything else.
Okay, thank you very much. I propose that we wrap up maybe by doing a tour now and answering on more political questions, should I say now. We're discussing what if never we join to the European Union, but actually, do you see any signs of political momentum for the Balkans appearing now? We had the Juncker signal, we had some kind of time frames. There are many different things going on now that were not so visible a couple of months only ago. So extremely briefly, is there a possible momentum for the membership of Western Balkans? So let's start with Denisa, but really briefly.
Well, from where I would be sitting in Sarajevo, it doesn't seem like there is a momentum. And I disagree with our foreign minister who said this morning that giving a date to Montenegro and Serbia somehow opens the door for Bosnia as well. I think this is, as you said, this is one of the scenarios which we haven't discussed today. And what if not all of the countries enter there? And to me, this is the really scary scenario. So the question, I just want to finish with the question rather than a statement, is the price of keeping the Western Balkans outside or in the waiting room for a long time higher than the price of letting the Western Balkans in, even if not fully prepared?
Okay, thank you very much. Aleksandar, is there a potential for momentum?
Yeah, I was planning to end on a positive note. Especially this year, the summit in Trieste, in Trst, was quite positive for the region. And I think the proposed actions is something to be implemented and to be seen in the context what we have discussed. The promise of regional economic area is something that we are so looking forward to see how it will impact the citizens of the life of citizens, how we impact the economic development, the development of the countries, and so on. Also, the rhetoric adopted by President Juncker is something that is encouraging, meaning that the strategic plan for integration of Montenegro and Serbia is a positive sign in this direction. Also, this coincides with the change of government in Macedonia and signing of the bilateral agreement with Bulgaria, and also the promise to engage deeper in conversation with Greece, because it's as a regional pending issue is something that should be discussed, because it's the way in a way, it's blocking the further progress of the country in regard to the EU. So there is a positive momentum, I will say. So I hope it will continue.
Okay, Jovana, what should we expect from the strategy for accession of Serbia and Montenegro? Although in the Commission they say it's for everybody, not only for those two countries. Can it be a kind of roadmap that would make the process more concrete?
I don't see the 2025 as a promised year for Serbia and Montenegro, and I don't see positive developments at the moment. I don't know what will be the content of the strategy. As I said, I don't see the purpose of the new instrument, as we already have negotiation process and have conditionality policy, but they explain, and as I understood it, that there will be some kind of institutional setup, how the EU institutions will look with this new accession of the two countries. So basically we have to wait and to see what new will be there.
Okay, the strategy should come out in February or beginning of the next year, so we'll see if it's a kind of new moment for the accession, at least for those two countries. And Milos,
yes,
what do you make of it?
We will see what the strategy comes with, but politically speaking in Serbia, sorry, I think that from the perspective of the elites, we are currently in the, let's say, good situation when it comes to the EU integration, because somehow we are very, let's say, satisfied with the fact that negotiation chapters are being opened, right, in these last years, and we are, I think, counting these numbers, we have 10, 2 provisionally closed, and we are expecting new to be open by the end of the year. So in this, let's say, official political discourse, this means something in terms of advancement. Right, so even without commenting on the 2025 as a potential year, but I agree there with Jovana, this is, I think that in official discourse, this is seen as a going forward. What will this in the end result with in terms of how we negotiate these chapters, and what is our starting position once we complete the negotiations and let's say, become members, we will see. But I think that from the civil society perspective, the mere fact of starting negotiations and opening the chapters is, of course, not enough to say what has been done so far and what has been achieved. So instead, we should focus on the quality rather than the quantity, I think.
Quality rather than... Okay. Nikolaos, yes. Is there a window of opportunity?
Yeah. They are good news, and these are structural news. The first structural good news is, unfortunately, Brexit. Although the Balkans lose an advocate of EU enlargement, at the same moment, Brussels wants to show that the European project is alive. And the European project is alive when they are both deepening and expansion. These two dimensions have so far been in parallel, and this is an external structural factor which somehow explains also Juncker's State of Union address reference to the Balkans. The second, again, structural factor, which is an opportunity, it's the USA conviction that the Russian influence in the region, to use Yi's words, is malign, is bad. So there is a Western concern about the Russian influence, which, to my opinion, is overrated, that pushes for a need to review these policies and bring quickly results. But these external pull factors, this external good news, will be meaningless if the leaderships here do not make their own homework.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this was a good way to wrap up our discussion, to be in line with the political dimension and the news also. Many issues have been raised here, many questions, limits of the EU transformative power, limits of the democratization process, and so on. But many, of course, of them were not possible to address during this panel. I guess we will all see which scenarios of all those mentioned will actually materialize. I propose that we all meet in a couple of years here and to check what actually happened. Thank you very much. Thank you to panelists, and thank you for your attention. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The panel is starting immediately. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The panel is starting immediately. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The panel is starting immediately. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The panel is starting immediately. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The panel is starting immediately.
Still because Može? Može? Okay. Okay, Kurt says, okay, we should start. That's it. Otherwise, we will relabel the panel in participants in retreat. Is absenteeism at conferences in the afternoon after heavy lunch a norm, a new norm? No, it's not. You're here at the right place, at the right panel, which is entitled as Democracy in Retreat, More Populism as the New Norm. My name is Goran Buldivski, and I work for Open Society Initiative for Europe out of Budapest, which many way will say could become the new European capital of populism, though Peter will disagree with me. He is much stronger in his words. Or rather, I promise you, and they will deliver, quite an exciting panel for a number of reasons. One is because this is a subject that I'm sure you've heard of. This is a subject that I'm sure you've discussed before, but I do hope that you will get at least a couple of insights which are new and you haven't heard before. We got the toughest task because after lunch we know where your blood is. That's certainly not up in the brain, so I'll ask the panelists to be relatively provocative and then to make you also think and then maybe ask questions. Who is on the panel today? You can read in the brochure. I'll just put very short snippets. We have Catherine Fieschi, who actually wrote for The Guardian that Le Pen will not be elected many months before, and in the process she earned something like what, 2,500 haters and deniers that telling her that she's wrong. But more importantly, she's also director of a think tank in London, Counterpoint, and they've published a lot of interesting things. I personally recommend for you to read the Recapturing the Reluctant Radical. Edith is a former deputy minister of foreign affairs of Albania, also someone who has dedicated part of her professional life in understanding and promoting Kosovo. She's based in Tirana and now runs a think tank. Petar Kreko is commentator of Hungarian political affairs, but he's also something like a chief conspiracy theorist or a conspiracy theorist in chief. You know, with a PhD on the subject. Not many people have that, but he's really a person. If you want to learn about the political right in Europe and also about the most prevalent conspiracy theories, as well Hungarian society. And last but not least, Slavomir, who is a quite well-known sociologist and political commentator in his native Poland. He's a founder of Krytyka Polityczna. In spite of the difficult spelling, I really, really recommend to check their website. It's quite an interesting thing. If you're lazy to get the Polish spelling, get the English one, Political Critique. And Slavomir also, you know, he has a lot of things you can read in the bio, but one thing that really struck me is that he has been co-writing and he has been acting in a movie or a trilogy which was called "And Europe Will Be Stunned." And Europe was stunned in many ways in the last years. I don't know whether it was because of your movie or not. Now, okay, let's start. So I promise that we will keep you a bit entertained in addition to the substance. So the first piece of entertainment is a very, very quick poll, which also our panelists will start. Populism cannot be divorced from a debate on democracy, as I hope everybody will agree. And populism is only one of these words that gives a very strange adjective or connotation to democracy. But I think first, let me check something which is in the room, which is about democracy itself. And I have a very simple question asking you to raise your hand if you agree with the statement. And that is, raise your hand if you live in a country that you consider democratic. So if you live in a democracy, raise your hand. And look around and see how many people live in democracy. Okay, very good. I have another question, and that's about populism, and then you will get the speakers. The question about populism is a bit more layered. It again includes you. We've made a big deal in the rest of Europe about the rise of populist parties. And everybody says, oh, we have 1, 2, 3 or more. Now let me test the feeling also in the room, knowing that there are a lot of people from the Balkans, but not only. So I want to get the people who think that in their country or the country where they live, there is one populist party. So if you think that you have one populist party in your country, raise your hand. And no, okay, there will be 1, 2, and then all of them. Okay, so 1, 2, or all of them. That will be the option. So those who think that there is one populist party in your country. Only one. Those of you who think that there are 2 or 3, let's make it 2 or 3, okay? And those of you who think that all political parties are populist in your country. Okay, good. So, good. Now you got a bit the sense of the room. You see that there are actually a number of people who think that all of their parties are populist. So we have to get to the subject. Catherine, let's start with you. She has been following a lot the happenings what has happened in Great Britain, also France. And a lot of this phenomenon was first witnessed there. So maybe we should start with your introductory remarks.
Great, thank you very much. So I want to make just a few discrete points, and then hopefully these can be up for discussion. I think that one of the things that I want to, the first point I want to make connects very well to the question that was just asked about which of the parties that in the country you live in do you consider to be populist, and do you consider to be living in a democracy? As somebody who's had the the ideological misfortune, but on the other hand, the good fortune of studying populism for far too long at this point. And I don't look like I'm about to be out of a job yet, to be honest. I think that one of the things that I'm always struck by these days is that everything is labeled populist. And in fact, that there's even a huge confusion between things that are popular and things that are populist. And I think that there's a good reason for that, but that it's still worth saying that, you know, not every popular measure is a populist measure. Not every popular party is a populist party. And we have to be careful about seeing populism everywhere, although there is a fair bit of it, I grant you that. But I think that this goes back, and it's worth saying, and I've said it far too many times, I think, but it is worth saying that actually there is no real populism without democracy, that you need a democratic system. You need the promises of democracy for populism to arise. There's got to be a sense of broken promise. There's got to be a sense of betrayal. And a democratic political system is the system within which and through which promises can be made and promises can be broken. So I think that this is something that, you know, when we think about populism, you know, it's something that we need to keep in mind. There's a very good, wonderful scholar of populism, Margaret Canavan, you know, who once wrote about populism as a shadow cast by democracy. And I think that this is something that's worth bearing in mind. The second point that I want to make, because we were told to be brief, is a point specifically about France and Britain. And I think that the point here connects to what to do and what not to do in the face of populist sentiment, and particularly in the face of the rise of populist parties. And for me, I think there's something very interesting about the case for Brexit and UKIP and the Conservative Party on the one hand in the UK, and also what happened in France around the FN and the presidential elections and then the legislative elections. For me, one of the consequences of the presence of populist parties in political systems is that they tend, obviously, to segment the country into two: the people versus the elite, or even more broadly, you know, the liberal cosmopolitans and the left behinds. There is always this segmentation of two populations that are rival. There's two ways that people tend to react to this, and more, I think, over the past 10 years, there's been a rallying cry that actually mainstream political parties, both on the left and on the right, should try to adopt more populist tactics, that they should try and speak to the electorate through populist terms. The populists are doing well by keeping it simple, by offering solutions that, soi-disant, just cater to irrationality and bare emotions. We should do the same thing. Well, that's what we did in Britain, and that really did not get us very far. The hypersimplification of political sentiment, the hypersimplification of solutions on both sides got us to where we are now. And I would say that even though I'm not about to argue that this is the end of populism in France, far from it, I would say that Macron and his campaign do teach us a lesson about the fact that you can actually win and you can actually do well without talking stupid, without oversimplifying, by keeping a positive project, and by not giving in to this idea that what you have to do is absolutely dumb it down and only appeal to people's fears. It doesn't mean, as I said, that that the problem is gone. And so I would conclude on this, which is my third point, which is I think that in the aftermath of the Dutch elections about 5-6 months ago, and then in the aftermath of the French elections, there was a sense of well, maybe the populist wave has crested. Maybe we're going to be okay. Of course not. My view is that we need to stop focusing only on the fortunes of populist political parties, and look at the deeper, broader, and much more significant transformations of politics and of people's political expectations, which have changed fundamentally and unfortunately align very, very well with the promises of immediacy, of directness, and of voice that populist parties instrumentalize. And of course, the evolutions of our political systems, the evolution of our social media, of our media, mean that actually, I think that what we're entering is probably, you know, the golden age of populism, and we're going to have to get a lot more creative than we have so far. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Catherine. Slavomir, you live in Warsaw, and where you follow what's happening there, but also you keep an eye on what's happening in the rest of Europe. What's the take from your angle?
I see that my points that I will try to be very clear on, and I will enumerate them, are a little bit referring to the questions of Goran and are a little bit polemical to what you have said, Catherine, though we know each other a little. The thing is that we used to say that populism is attacking democracy in Poland, in Hungary, in the United States, actually everywhere. But it's actually not exactly democracy that it's under attack, it's more liberalism. And those two traditions, not only theoretically, but historically, are quite different traditions. Of course, they are now a joint tradition mostly after Second World War, but there is nothing necessary in this. I would even say that could be quite contingent. Populists, they know how to win elections. They can do it democratically, and usually they do it democratically. Kaczynski fully legitimate one election in Poland, and at least first election won and the second election won by Orban were also honest. Only the third one, there were a lot of gerrymandering in it and like not free media fully and so on, were not fully democratically. But they are able to do it. What they hate and what they really attack and what is really their enemy is a liberal tradition. What means liberalism from this point of view? Independent and free media, independent judiciary, separation of power, constitutional court, like exactly all those independent institutions that populists attack, because independency from them, it's exactly what they are angry on. Like they are taking over institutions, civil society is an adversary for them, NGOs, and they just don't want to have any independent institutions in their country. And this is exactly what they are doing in Poland. It's what they did already in Hungary, unfortunately. And this is why they announced, both Orban and Kaczynski, illiberal democracy. So it's exactly what they wanted to do, okay? Now, my second point is, look, they even try, and they do it quite efficiently, they use democratic discourse against liberal arguments. What they say exactly? They're saying, you don't want us to eliminate separation of power. You don't want us to change the law about media, about judiciary. But come on, we won the election. We have a majority. We are elected, and people wanted us to change, okay? So if you don't agree with us, you're attacking the democratic choice. Okay, and it's quite efficient. It's not easy to argue with this. Of course, then you can explain that democracy is not only about majority, it's about also reserving some rights for minority, and this is like a second part of the definition of democracy, and so on and so on. But actually, it's more complex argument that people can really get, like in most of the media, in the public discourse, and so on and so on. For many people, democracy is who wins the election can change the country. Okay, so this is this is actually quite important, because if we wanna preserve our democracy, we have to like do something with this argument. The third thing is. What exactly made them, at least in Poland, so efficient? I would say that what they do in Poland, what Kaczynski did, he took everything what is most attractive from both fascism and socialism. In a sense that as long as he controls the question of refugees, and as long as he launched the largest social transfers in a Polish history, and Polish economy is doing well enough to have these social transfers and still to have a strong budget, strong economy, strong growth, and so on, he will control this country and win any election he wants. And in the same time, he rearranged the political scene. And not only he rearranged political scene, but he arranged the social background behind it, okay? Before, Civic Platform, the party built by Tusk and the largest opposition party today, and Kaczynski party, they had almost the same electorate from the socio-economical point of view, okay? Of course, Kaczynski government was a little bit more religious, but it was not like a huge difference, had a little bit bigger support from the Catholic Church, but it doesn't mean that the Tusk had not. Tusk was also a very conservative politician. For 8 years, they didn't change any law about the cultural values, like, you know, the women's right, the sexual education in school. They even changed. They preserved the right of religion in schools, but they never launched lessons about sexual education. After 7 years, the only thing that they did, of course, I'm not talking about same-sex unions and so on, was nothing like that was for Tusk important. Only in vitro, after 7 years, with the support of 75% of society and 2 other parties, they after being scared for so many years, they launched some programs, okay, but without referendum and so on. So we really had 2 central right parties. Now, because they divided the scene so strongly, and this would be my polemical point with Katrin, politics is always about dichotomies. It's nothing new that, you know, the political scene is divided. The new thing and the horrible thing is that the parties, they do not treat themselves as adversaries, but as the enemies of the country. Okay, for Kaczynski, the opposition is not the regular partner in politics. It's a disaster for Poland. This is like the end of Poland. This is the adversary. This is the enemy that you have to destroy. Okay, not just to win election. This is why he wants to limit the rights of opposition, and he feels legitimate to do it. And this is how the people think about it. The people think that Tusk for them is a devil, this guy killed the president in the Smolensk catastrophe together with Putin. Like, this is what the electorate of Kaczynski think, and this is what Kaczynski wants them to think. And for us, the oppositional political commentators, yes, Kaczynski is a disaster for Poland, because it is. He isolated the country in Europe. He wants to change Poland to be from the poster country for the tiger of Europe, for the most successful country in Europe. Now it's the country which is the biggest problem for European Union. It's a shame. It's a disaster for Poland. And in this part of the world, you cannot be nobody. You cannot be not a part of integration, European integration. You cannot be in a good relations with Western Europe, because you're gonna get soon, Russian influence here. For more than 250 years, out of 300, Poland was either not on the map or was controlled by Russia. It was a satellite country. People know it, okay? So for us, Kaczynski is just, the only beneficiary of his policy is Putin. Putin is only the one happy guy about it, at least in this continent. So my last point would be that if you wanna do something like with this, if you wanna be successful in opposing Kaczynski, you have to do 2 things. somehow neutralize the question of refugees. You cannot just think in a moral sense about it. You cannot like meet all the moral expectations in the same time not meeting any election criterion, because you're gonna be very moral, but you're not gonna have liberal democracy nor refugees in your country, okay? And the second thing, you have to somehow overbeat populists in the social arguments. And at least in Poland, with this economy that we have now, can easily, like, you know, overbeat Kaczynski also in the question of social transfers. The only problem is that people will always ask you, you could do it. Tusk government could do it for so many years, and they did not. This is actually how Kaczynski could prove his conspiracy theory, because he had a conspiracy theory. The government can give you the money. The state is rich. They don't give you because they either stole it or there are bad people, they don't want to give it to you. I will come and I will do it. He came, he did it, okay? So actually, you know, his populist conspiracy theory appeared to be, you know, quite true, at least for the people, okay? Kaczynski changes his mind all the time. 10 years ago, he was hard neoliberal. He wanted to have flat tax. Now he's a, you know, he was even anti-clerical 10 years ago. Now he's, you know, pro-clerical. He's very religious politician, very socialist in the same time. So it's not about his real idealism that would like to, you know, be helpful so much to the people. No, he's just a very efficient populist from this point of view. But he's efficient as long as he has these two questions under control, refugees and social transfers.
Thanks. Thanks, Slavomir. I mean, speaking about opportunists, Peter, probably, you know, it's your turn now to talk about the other opportunists of Europe, Viktor Orban. But let me throw a question. Do you feel, living in Budapest, that we are deprived of the liberal or of the democracy? What do you feel more deprived of as living in Budapest today?
Very good question. And yeah, I think, yeah, Viktor Orban pretty much agree, I mean, with the argument that the liberalism and democracy is something too different, because his main argument is that what's going on in Hungary is that there is an illiberal democracy being built up, under which he means that it's democracy should not be always liberal. And it can be built on, let's say, national basis as well. But the problem with that is that I don't think that democracy in the current sense, yeah, if we take into consideration even, let's say, the more elitist element of democracy, the institutions can exist without the liberal minimum. And practically what's happening in Hungary is the undermining the liberal minimum, which manifests finally into a really deteriorating democratic standard. And the thing is that I have not raised my hand when you asked me if I live in a democracy or not. Even 2 years ago, I would have raised my hands. But right now, what's going on, destroying the institutional checks and balances against the governmental and parliamentary power are so quick and so powerful, and especially as we approach the elections next year. For example, practically no opposition parties can put out any billboards because the governmental agencies take them down. I think we are heading to an elections. The previous election was not, I would say that it was not fair but free. The next one, I'm afraid, the freeness will be questioned seriously as well. So it's a very quick process, and I think it raises serious question marks about the potency of the European Union to be able to put their member states under pressure and keep them on a democratic path In Hungary, we can say that it's not a democracy anymore, it's a hybrid regime anymore. It's a very soft hybrid regime, but it's more a hybrid regime than a democracy, and built on illiberal rhetorics and illiberal policies. Also, a few years ago, the situation in Hungary was that there was a populist party, Fidesz, and there was a radical, or I would say extreme right party, Jobbik, that was strongly anti-Semitic, strongly anti-Roma, and even irredentist and so on. Right now, because of a very bizarre parallel tendency, practically Fidesz and Jobbik have traded places. So Fidesz went more to the right, more to the liberal, more to the radical direction, and especially after the refugee crisis, practically it became a genuine far-right party. Not just I'm saying that, leading scholars of populism and radicalism telling the same. Kasmudde says, for example, that Fidesz fulfills all the three criteria of far-right parties, populist, radical right parties, as he called them: populism, authoritarianism, and nativism. Nativism is the politics that puts in the center of ideology the native people, the people who are living, the Hungarians in our case. And since the refugee crisis, practically 95% of governmental rhetorics is about refugees, that they should not come to our country. Not that less should come, zero should come. Also about that George Soros is organizing a big conspiracy using the European Commission as puppets to flood refugees in Europe, because European Commission and George Soros want to destroy the nation states and want to make Hungary and Europe practically Eurabia, so a Muslim continent. So conspiracy theories of this extreme, it was even unimaginable, I think, 3 years ago in Hungary, but it's a really quick process. And right now, I would say that Hungary have become a country where populism, I think, practically, as a word, lost its meaning. Right now, there is Jobbik, the previous far-right party, that is shifting more and more towards the center. The leader of Jobbik has a role model, Aleksandar Vučić, and he says that he wants to do something similar, and he did, coming from quite a radical political position, going toward the center and be the pro-European party in a country where the government uses so blatant anti-European rhetoric that some, I think, Nigel Farage sometimes could be envious about. And I would raise 3 points where I feel, just to give you an indication of what's going on these days in Hungary, where I would say that Serbia performs far better in terms of democratic standards than Hungary. First of all, as I've heard a few years ago, I've seen the program as well, there was a big conference of NGOs dealing with the refugee issue here in Belgrade, all around the region. Who opened this conference? Aleksandar Vučić. In Hungary, the NGOs who are dealing with the refugees are treated as traitors, as labeled as terrorists, and recently a pro-governmental commentator told it in a government-controlled media outlet that practically it's a war period, and in this period these traitors, these people smugglers, can be shut down without any jurisdiction. And he is a consultant in the Budapest Council, and he was not even expelled from this position. So the radicalization of the Hungarian political discourse is quite extreme. I know that George Soros has at least an ambivalent reputation in Serbia as well, but I have not seen campaigns where you can step up to the tram and step on the face of George Soros, because in a big big advertisement campaign against George Soros. There was some even billboards put on the floor of the trams and so on. So one point. Second point, I would totally, it would be really hard to imagine that Fidesz would delegate in any leading positions, not to prime minister, a gay person, because it's like the attitude of the Hungarian government is far more conservative, I would say, that even the mainstream parties in the Western Balkans, that is traditionally a much more conservative region, towards gay people, gay marriage, and things like that. And sometimes the statements, especially in the Pride days, are just horrible about gay people. And yeah, the last thing I would say is the attitude towards the European Union. So while in Serbia, I know that yeah, the attitude of the European Union is not as bright as it used to be beforehand, but I pretty much feel from an outsider perspective that there is rather a strengthening political consent in Serbia about joining the European Union. And if there is one thing in which I'm totally with the Hungarian government, is that the Western Balkan countries should join, and they try to provide some help to the Serbian government as well. It's a question how useful it is, but they took it seriously, that they want Western Balkans countries, and especially Serbia, to join and provide some help. But at the same time, the rhetoric that the Hungarian government uses against the European Union is sometimes, as I said, worse than most Eurosceptic, Euro-reject parties use in the Western Union. So blaming Brussels with the West conspiracy against the Hungarian nation and painting it as the real enemy of Hungarians is an everyday thing. And the lucky thing in Hungary is that the European Union still keeps its popularity, but of course it makes some damage done. And one lesson to learn from the Hungarian example for Serbia, I would say, is that in Hungary, for example, there was a quite important democratic development until we joined the European Union, because the European Union is usually good in raising democratic standards for associate and candidate countries, but it is really bad when it comes to member states. They usually do not so much, and what they do is too little, too late in the case of Hungary these days, but I would say even in the case of Poland, probably. So I think you should be really afraid about the future of your democracy when you join the European Union, because before that, the democratic development is more granted than after that. After 2004, and the socialist governments in Hungary had some role in that as well, there was a really spectacular decline of democratic institutions and democratic norms, and unfortunately it resulted in a situation when populism, as I said, lost its meaning. It's an euphemism.
Thanks, Peter. And yeah, by no means I influence him as coming from the Balkans. I was joking with my Central European friends that I already came very well equipped to deal with this environment, because in the Balkan countries before where I worked, you know, we saw similar, if not even worse developments.
Totally disagree with this. Like me both and Catherine, like.
You will get the floor. Let me get first to Edith with her opening remarks, and as you can see, you know, I promise you certain excitement. There you go. You'll get it. Edith, how is all that looked from the Balkan perspective? As I said before here, we said, oh, we only breed populists. You saw how many hands were there in the audience when said that everybody is populist. How does that look from your perspective?
Now, first of all, listening to the last two speakers, I would say, do you guys need a hand? Because from this part of the world, which is very close to your border, is not that bad news as you're describing in Hungary and Poland, actually. Although it is bad news, but not as bad as you are suggesting. So saying this, I would disagree slightly with Slavomir. Not disagree, but actually when I put it in the context of the region of the Balkans, I would say that The reason for a rise of populism, it is definitely a decline in democratic values, or not actually decline, because it did not have democratic values per se, but a dysfunctioning democracy that normally rules throughout the region. Now, to me, populism, it is a political identity. And a political identity that expresses itself in different ways. And one of them, of course, it is also anti-pluralism at one point. And what you described earlier, it comes to that as well. The other one, it is, of course, when we put it in the context of the Balkans, it is like everywhere else, failing of elites, political elites in general. But here the political elites are divided in two. And this is a question. Because of the past history, because of the ethnic feuds in the past, and you know, the communist rule 25 years ago, which was more severe in many other countries, at least in Albania, the political elites are divided in two, and that is the local political elites, and the second, it is the international political elites. When I talk about international political elites, because the local one everybody has, if there were so many hands raised here on populist movement in your countries, you know, it means that you understand what failing local political elite means. But international political elite failing, meaning that there has not been enough guarantees and issued enough guarantees regarding this build-up towards democratic norms in the region in general. And I come to a point where during the last 3 or 4 years I've tried to articulate quite a lot in most of the forums that I've been in. This region normally consumes more politics that it can hold in itself. It is also historical politics as well. It is at times also quite nationalist politics as well. And this is another norm of populism in this region, because it gets a nationalist connotation, not always the democratic one, not always the plays with democracy and liberalism. It goes into nationalism quite often. So by trying to put so much emphasis on stability and security in the entire region during the last, I would say, 17 years, one has forgotten to understand that this has happened to the detriment of building a sound democracy. And this is a pattern throughout the region. When we speak about those parameters that Slavomir said about liberalism, I would say that they are democratic norms in our part of the world. Rule of law, fight against corruption, many of these other norms like the human rights issues, they are all issues that pertain democracy in our countries. But of course they come to one point together, they join together to one point where normally politicians in the region, when they really want to come up and to appeal to the mass, they turn their back and then they play with nationalist feelings of the region. This has been the issue during the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years, and we have seen it easily with this great love affair between the leaders in Albania and in Serbia, up to the point that you were saying, how does it come, where did this one come from? You know, is it just the European Union or the Germans or the Americans who have encouraged the leaders to show up together and to show this great friendship between Serbs and Albanians, which is there anyway, but it is natural in itself. It doesn't need to be pampered by politicians, because probably they make it worse. So they turn to these nationalistic feelings, but also to a sort of competition between leaders. And that is also a pattern of populist movements in the region as well. Regarding EU, because that was one of the touching topics, Look, many EU officials, they say today that, or also analysts, they describe today that the problem with populist movements in the region, in the Balkans, is different from the others, because here is the mainstream parties that have turned populists, rather than we having populist movements. And the only place which is interesting enough in the region where we have seen a populist movement which has turned into an anti-establishment movement has been Kosovo. During the last 5 years, we have seen a rise of a movement which is called Vetvendosia, that it resulted into elections, the last parliamentary elections in Kosovo, with almost 27%, which is a very large amount for a unit, for a political unit that came out as a movement and then transferred into a political party. Again, it was quite populist in all his rhetoric, and I believe that it was more of a protest vote and the way how Vetvendosia leaders appeal to the mass and the failing political elites in Kosovo in general. But everywhere else in the region, this pattern has not gone exactly on an anti-establishment movement, not yet at least. I think that if democratic norms derail further, or if the people in the region will not be able to take their fate in their own hands and stop this populist move, or stop their leaders becoming autocratic leaders and adopt this populist rhetoric, then the situation will worsen, and we might see even everywhere else in the region anti-establishment movements. But then could be dangerous, because that could then turn into the detriment of stability and the detriment of security. And it goes as a cycle in this region. It's not like everywhere else in Europe. Now, what do Europeans do, and what should be a sort of solution, or what should the Europeans try to look at? First of all, Europeans need to be a good example as far as the Balkans are concerned. Because not only the case of Poland and Hungary, but you see nowadays even secessionist movements in the region, and you see what happens with it in Europe, and you see what happens with the secessionist movements as well. And of course the double standards of EU in general, of Brussels, regarding treatment of these movements, like it was the case in Spain. That's the first thing, is be a good example. Secondly, I think Brussels and Washington should not pamper autocratic leaders in the region to the cost of keeping the Balkans safe, because that goes to the detriment of democratic norms. And thirdly, you deal more with dysfunctional democracies, rather than you deal with matters of security and stability. And with the third element that has come nowadays, that for the last 3 or 4 years is one of the hot topic, which is the external threats to the region. There is so much discussion on that. And at the end of the day, we forget that there are certain things that is called the rule of law, or fight against corruption, or independent institutions that have been neglected for so long. At the very end, I would just like to conclude it. The general pattern of populist movements in the region, it is basically the same everywhere. I would not like to pinpoint a single country from the 6 countries in the Western Balkans now that do not have the same problems. And the expression of this populist rhetoric and this populist drive, it is absolutely the same. And at the end of the day, I would credit this to history, to the past, to transitional democracies. Democracy has not established itself. And the last one would be the role of the international community. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks. Before I get to your questions, I mean, there were some reactions. So, Catherine, go ahead. You had a different interpretation of what's happening in the European Union.
Well, no, I mean, I think that I was just a little surprised to hear my friend Peter say beware. But no, I just wanted to I just wanted to make a couple of points. One is I think it ties some of the various issues that were brought up on this panel. You mentioned the local elites or national elites versus an international elite. I think that one of the hallmarks of the kinds of populist politics that we are witnessing, whether it's in this part of Europe or in different parts of Europe or even in the United States, is the populist accusation is that the national elite have more in common with their international counterparts than they do with the people that they're supposed to serve and to represent. That's one of the foundational claims of populism, that somehow once these people who claim to be of the left or of the right and so on to represent different factions get into power, they developed a separate set of interests that are more in tune with a class of international liberal politicians, and they become detached from the people that they're supposed to represent. They no longer have the best interests of their nation at heart. That's one of the accusations that comes up again and again. And I think that when I think of the UK, I was out. Do I live in a democracy? Yes, I do. But right now, I live in the worst kind of democracy. Right? I live in a democracy which is the narrowest form of democracy, majoritarian. The 52% are going to tell the 48% just exactly where to get off. Right? Now that's one version of democracy. It's the so-called will of the people. But the accusation there is that it's not about the left or about the right. It's really about the people who have been left behind by an international cosmopolitan class in the Conservative Party and in the Labour Party versus this elite. So I think that I just want to end on your point about all politics is dichotomous. I think that there's two interesting things here, is that I would say that elections are dichotomous, political arguments are dichotomous, but politics aren't necessarily dichotomous. So you can belong to a political party, and you can make your will known in terms of your wish at election time, but there's also give and take in terms of winning on some issues, losing on some other issues, because you don't just belong to one group. You belong to many groups. And I think that this is what populism does to a political landscape, is that it reduces the whole of politics to a dichotomy, as opposed to just elections to a dichotomy. And I think that that's something that we need to think about. Of course, it's going to be adversarial. Of course, there's going to be winners and losers. But what's interesting here is that, what's being shown in the current political climate is that, first of all, it's not about the usual adversaries, left and right. And secondly, that it's a dichotomy that is supposed to be driven right through the political process. This is why referendums are, the order of the day. It's because basically you reduce everything to a binary issue. Welcome to what I call Colosseum politics. Thumbs up, thumbs down. I like, I don't like. I want, I don't want, right? Now, there's an element of that in elections, but it doesn't have to sum up your politics.
Thanks. Quick comment from Slavomir?
I think there is a certain agreement between us, or a full agreement even. To put it in another way, it's about the dichotomy, but inside a certain limit, okay? Like, if it excludes any compromise, then actually the politics ends, okay? If the politics or democratic politics can only survive inside the liberal democracy. What Kaczynski did, he went outside the liberal democracy, okay? To put it shorter, it's good when it's left or right, it's bad when it's right or wrong, okay? And this is what we exactly have now in Poland. I would like to do actually 3 points, quick. Okay, my first point, listen, it's very easy, I'm talking about 1989, the transition, and like all of it, that we all are together. It's quite easy to implement democracy, like democratic procedures, election procedures, and so on. It's much harder to implement liberalism, okay? To have liberal democracy, you need liberals first. And if you don't have a liberal tradition in your country, or it's very weak tradition in your country, then it's not gonna be easy to have liberal democracy, all right? You need time, you need like actually the kind of a re-education that cannot be like forced, okay, in your society. You have to really have another generation. It takes time, okay? This is why we can have some troubles with liberalism. But if Americans and Brits have some troubles, there are two fatherlands of rationalism and liberalism, then you cannot be surprised by Kaczynski or Orban, okay? Trump is even more astonishing person. My second point would be to Peter, like, well, tell to the Serbians, like, well, stay as, or like it's better for you if you're gonna be associated country, but it's gonna go at your expense, or it will work against your democracy if you go be inside. I mean, it's like to propose a disaster. Listen, like, first of all, why EU was established? Was it established to preserve democracy or welfare? It was not the first aim. The first aim was security, to prevent the war. It was the product of the Second World War. Just let's prevent the wars inside Europe and never have it again. This is why, especially for the region of Eastern Europe, but also for your region, Balkans. Balkans actually, it's a synonym of wars in the history of Europe. Okay, if you wanna prevent it. If you think in the long-term future, and if you remember history, what you really need here, but also in Ukraine, or in Poland, or here, is exactly the European Union, okay? The problem is that we forgot this lesson that our countries really cannot survive being not a part of the larger structure. And the best larger structure, also because of inequalities, is EU. EU is the only part of the world when inequalities are lower. Well, relatively. The inequalities are the smallest in the EU. Look at the countries outside, okay? Ukraine was a higher level, a little bit on the higher level of economy and inequalities for sure in the 1989. Look at them now. The GDP per capita is $5,000. Okay, in Hungary it's about 2,000. It's about $20,000. Okay, especially with the poverty. Like per capita at least, it's even in Belarus it's much better. Okay, so and look, if you are associated country too long, like Turkey, it produces resentment. Okay, time is important. It's only a temporary project. You cannot be associated. You cannot be in negotiations for so long. It's gonna produce resentment inside the society, inside your political elites, and so on. Well, yeah, let's say that it was my last point. Okay. I hope.
Thank you. Sorry to put pressure. I want to have time for questions. And Peter, let me get into your defense because otherwise we will have a debate only with the panel. No, the defense is very simple. As somebody who has been working here in the Balkans and knows, you know, we are all born and bred on so-called Copenhagen criteria, and everybody probably here in the room will recite our, you know, the Acquis 23rd chapter, 24th chapter, and so on. And frankly speaking, also Hungarians and Poles and all of them before 2004 could have recited the same poem. Today, in European Union, there is nothing that resembles the Copenhagen criteria. So in so many ways, and Peter, maybe I had a different argument, but let me put in this one in a way. in the defense of what you were saying, is that to some extent, once when countries are inside the European Union, there are no mechanisms. So that's why actually the transition process is crucial in order of sorting out democratic standards. You'll have a chance to, okay, 2 sentences, I'll count. Go ahead.
First, yeah, I think, and I underlined it pretty clear, I think it's in favor of Serbia and practically all the candidate and associate countries to join the European Union, and there are many benefits of that. But second, don't expect that the mere fact of being the member of the European Union keeps you away for the democratic problems. And for that respect, sorry, a third sentence, I do think that the pre-accession process should be used and valued pretty much, because it is the good period for institution building and for strengthening democratic norms that afterwards, I think, rather disappears. There is a very good study of CSIS.
That's a fourth sentence.
Okay.
That's a fourth sentence. Studies come later. Okay. Otherwise, we'll have to give him an honorary membership to the Balkan crowd. You know, it starts with 2 sentences that are half a page long. Even Kant would envy at that. Okay, your time. So, questions? If you want to give comment, 2 sentences, but real 2 sentences, not Peter's 2 sentences. Introduce yourself and ask the question. We have one over here, one over there, one over there. Okay, let's go with these first 3, 4 questions. So let's start here in the first row. Let's start with.
Hi, Sonja Licht, guys, Belgrade Center for Security Policy. First question, I would like to ask colleagues of the links between populism and captured state. So, do populists necessarily draw on capturing the state through legal means? Because my impression is that that's what's going on in Hungary and Poland, that the whole system of governance is changed through legal means, so that it's very difficult to reverse it. And if I can link to it, what happens to change the dynamics that is not visible politics, that is not politics through rhetorics, billboards and the stuff that you were describing, but that keeps the society in this momentum? And if I can add just last question, any tips on bringing resilience within society? I mean, we've seen protests on education in Hungary and in Poland, massive protests. They're encouraging, however depressive the situation might be. So any tips where these protests came from or how this can be maintained?
Thanks. Thank you for these 4 questions. We have they're all good though.
It's on. Is it working? Yeah, okay. Kurt Piscevic, Democratization Policy Council in the University of St. Andrews. Following on that question, because I think what you could say is that there's a populist elites are governing in the Western Balkans now. They use populism, but they're very self-contained elites and self-reinforcing, indulged by the EU and the West for stability and security. But there are many in this room, but there is a potential constituency, unserved constituency of liberals and people, proponents of liberal democracy in this region, who have not been helped by their allies. I'd like your assessment of, is there a constituency for what would amount to a liberal insurgency in the Western Balkans? And what would you, those of you within the Union, how would you say that could be best helped from without?
Thank you. Very clear. We had the 3rd question over here and the 4th over there, and then I will get back to the panel and then another round, if we have time.
Thank you. Shpetim Gashi from the Council of Inclusive Governance. Ms. Hardy, to illustrate my question, mentioned this Kosovo party, Vedvendosia, that I think doubled in the last election, and because of their populist rhetoric. But when we look at their rhetoric, they addressed what we call bread and butter issues: corruption, organized crime, lack of education, and they named the carriers of corruption and education, which are both in public and private sector. But they're the populist party. But how do you address these issues in an unpopulist way?
Thank you. And let's have that question, and then we get back to the panel.
Good afternoon. I'm Violeta Beširević, a professor of constitutional law in Belgrade. I have short observation and then a question for you. Short observation goes to our distinguished guest from Budapest. Being someone who is commuting between Belgrade and Budapest last 25 years and being a professor of constitutional law, I am assure you that we in Serbia also live under populist administration, but the enemy is different. The question I have for the panel is the following. Any administration, whether populist or not, is not delighted with the power of the courts to check their power. But the populist administration more directly confront with the courts when they are not under their direct control. So my question is, to what extent you think the courts are capable to resist populist administration? We have some positive example coming from the UK, when the UK Supreme Court ruled that the British government must go to Parliament first and then to begin the negotiations with the EU. And we have some also negative examples. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we have the courts resisting the populist government, how to address real problems that populists raise, but in a non-populist way. Also, you know, where is the constituency and who could be the constituency for liberal democracy, both in Balkans and outside. And then, you know, that probably is connected with the resilience, this constant campaigning, the politics of the visible, the constant campaigning mode that the populists are doing, and the link between populism and captured state. So this is the sort of the range of questions. Let's start from Edith and then go this way. Please do not feel obliged to answer all of this. Pick and choose and try to be brief in order to have maybe one more round of questions.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, populism, part of the issue of populism, it is exactly state capture. That's what we've been discussing. The idea is that they try populist movements or populist elites, when they come into control, they normally try to control the entire political spectrum, or even the independent institutions. So that is a matter of state capture. In the Balkans, if we take it into the Balkans, as I said earlier in my presentation, because the mainstream parties have turned populist, it is this case the mainstream parties who try to capture the state, and you have a state capture everywhere in the region, or almost everywhere. In my country, Albania, I've read stories about Serbia. I've read stories, of course. We have seen what has happened with Macedonia before, and most of the countries in the region. But the difference between state capture in the region, in the Balkans, and the difference between state capture anywhere else in Europe or out of Europe, during these populist periods, populist movement periods or populist elite periods, it is exactly because here there is not an established democracy. While if they can put up with some democratic values, if what Slavomir said, at the end of the day, there is, there is a democracy, that there is liberalism, at the same time, that helps democracy that has come. While in this region, the democracy per se never flourished enough. So the state capture comes, I would say, it's quite feudal sometimes. The answer regarding populist elites or where to govern, which is what Kurt asked a bit earlier, is there any group, community here that I think the only community that should be looked, and probably this goes for EU as well, if it really wants to help the region, it is youth. And I think we need to work more with youth that they do not, it is the most untouched community, but we have to be very careful by the type of education that we use today in order not to have the same elites as the previous ones. And the last one for Vedvendosia that I wanted to answer. Everybody, all populist movements, they all have the same way of talking, the same rhetoric, the same way of addressing. They all address bread and butter. That's why they're a populist movement, because it is exactly where those elites, political elites, have failed to address that they enter in, And in this thing, I don't say that that's something bad, because I'm sure Goran would like to ask later on, is there anything good about populism? So the idea is, I don't see it bad if you address it, but the way is how you act at the end of the day. What would be the action that you take do you keep that promise? Because populists exactly come up at the time when the elites have not kept the promises. But do they keep the promises at the end of the day? I took Vedvendosya as an example to show the anti-establishment movement. Because at the end of the day, it has been a movement against establishment, and the vote has been a protest vote, despite the rhetoric that has been used. But let's see what happens afterwards. If Vedvendosya will come to power in Kosovo, then we will see how this populist movement will transfer, what will be the modality afterwards regarding how will it behave when it governs. Thank you.
Thanks.
I would like to respond to 2 points. One would be about populists on government. I think that the usual, let's say, rule is that populists in government are go to failure. So populism is something that usually works way better from opposition than from government, because you have to deliver on government and it's not so easy. And what the populists see usually is that the reason why it's not so easy to deliver are the institutional checks and balances. Therefore, and sometimes state capture is a tool for that, they try to weaken the checks and balances, and paradoxically it can lead sometimes to good output results of populist governance. I mean, perceived by the people. For example, in Hungary, there was a retroactive measure of the government that took back some of the benefits that state leaders received beforehand. 98% of these benefits. It was practically unconstitutional, and practically they changed the constitution with the 2/3 and then passed it away. And I mean, this kind of tool that you go against the institution for the people, if you can do it wise, then it can give you a huge credibility. And this is the thing in Hungary. And paradoxically, state capture, I mean, because it leads to, in a lot of cases, if it's a state captured by government close interest, to bigger centralization and sometimes more efficient policy making. And that's why I think there is a model right now in Central Eastern Europe to shift more from a populism is rhetoric to a populism is action model, which brings it a bit closer, I would say, to populisms in even Central and Southern America, that you have to deliver, because otherwise, as previous examples, first law and justice government, for example, have proved it can easily collapse. And the other point would be on the comparison between Budapest or Hungary and Serbia. I'm not saying at all that Serbia does not have any populist challenges. I just made a few comparisons where I see that because of this, let's say, external pressures that the wannabe EU membership put on the countries, the elites usually behave better in the period where they want to join the European Union, and I see some signs of that in Serbia. And one paradoxically, there's one good example about how the courts resist in Hungary as well. What we can see in Hungary, for example, is that that the prosecutor's office is practically the extended hand of the government that lost all its independence, but the courts, in most of the cases, just follow their own rules, and attempts to totally replace the courts with loyalists have practically failed. And at that point, the EU had a very important role, for example, not to blame the EU for everything.
Thanks. Catherine?
Just two quick points. One is that I'd like to link your question about the courts and your question about how to address some of these issues that are legitimate in non-populist ways. And I think that, you know, the British case gives us a clue here, which is that one of the things that the Supreme Court did is, you know, to use a sports metaphor, they they played the game, not the ball, right? They basically defended a process of politics. And I think that this is one of the things that we have to be able to do, those of us who don't count ourselves as populist, which is defend the process, which I think is a terribly difficult and hugely unsexy thing to do in the current times. Nobody wants to talk about the process of politics. Everybody wants to talk about their opinion. They want to talk about the quick solution. This is why most people stay in their own social media silos, because you just have to agree with each other on what the simple solution might be on either side of the fence. Whereas I think that we've become very, very bad at talking about process, right? We've used technocracy as a substitute to talk about the political process, right? Which is why technocracy and expertise have now got, such bad press. But if technocracy and expertise are at the service of a political process, then it can be extremely powerful and extremely convincing. I think the issue is that we've really become terribly bad at doing this in a way that is compelling for people. I mean, the minute I said the word political process, I could see half of you, your eyes rolled into your head, right? Because it's the sort of, it's like when somebody turns up on your doorstep and gives you statistics, right? But this is not what we're talking about. And this is what I meant about saying about getting a little bit more creative, because the way in which to address legitimate grievances that the populists verbalize in non-populist ways is to focus on the value of, a certain political process. But we need to be much, much better at it. And I just want to say one last thing on the issue of bread and butter issues, which is that one of the things that populist parties have been very good at, and I think that non-populist mainstream parties have fallen into this trap, is that they're very good at switching sides. So on the one hand, it's bread and butter issues. It's all about wages. It's all about no longer being able to afford, what my parents might have been able to afford, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then when whatever government is in power says, okay, well, we'll address the wages, we'll address certain things, the comeback is, it's not about wages, it's not about the money, it's about our culture. Right? And so then all of a sudden it flips and it becomes all about, our identity. It's not the fact that I don't have enough money, it's the fact that I don't recognize the street where I live, for example, right? Or nobody on the bus seems to speak the same language as myself. And the fact that, they switch from one to the other. Now, sometimes they get caught. If you take somebody like Marine Le Pen actually lost very big on the euro. Right? She got completely overtaken by the fact that actually her electorate was very worried about leaving the euro. And if you dug your heels in on that, from an economic perspective, people actually got scared. But it was a last-minute thing. The rest of the campaign was an identity campaign. So I think it's, you're right to bring up the bread and butter issues, but I think, one of the things that makes it very tricky to counter is that, 1 minute it's about wages, next minute it's about, our identity. And of course, we know that these things are inseparable.
Thanks. Slavomir?
The question about protests, where do they lead, which is a very interesting question, and there is a very interesting paradox, actually. First reservation, they are not so big, unfortunately. In Hungary, they were bigger. In Hungary, 2011, you had 300,000 people on the streets when there was a law about media to be passed. And it didn't change anything, actually, or at least it didn't change much. In Poland, 300,000 at least never happened. And, we are 40 million people population. So if we have let's say, 100,000 people on the street, and politicians, especially such tough politicians like Kaczynski, they can count. They know that 8 million people elected him. So if there is 100,000 people, there's nothing that he can be really scared about. And actually he can use it saying like, listen, these are the traitors, you know, let me defend you because those guys immediately will, you know, take back the social transfers I already offered you. So it's really not, but the paradox actually is different. You know what's the direct consequences of it, at least as for now? Well, in the question of abortion, they prevented Kaczynski to ban it totally. So only women were efficient. Only women really pushed him back. This is the only case for last too long. Exactly the same thing happened in USA. So what we have now, and this is the only social group that it's really really tough to populists, because if you look at what is really the antithesis to populism, to the global populism, is feminism. This is what populists hate everywhere in the world. And if you would take the Marxist definition of the revolutionary class, which class is really pauperized, which class really pay biggest costs and so on, there are women everywhere. And actually this is a good social group to resist populists. They are everywhere. Usually they have majority, they are very well educated, they are much more tough. They are similar in populists in a sense that they feel no shame when it comes to the streets. Usually, you know, liberals and like all those manifestations are like, let's go to the street, but come on, we have a distance to the ideas, let's have some fun at the same time. And on the other side, they have an army of tough, angry people, okay? And the populists, if you look at the people who are behind Kaczynski, they are really tough guys, okay? And the only tough opposition to them on the street are women. They don't scare. I mean, the rest are like, it's like really quite easygoing liberal, usually guys who don't really care much, at least the same much as women. So this is one thing, but again, it's not the paradox. This is quite obvious to me. But the paradox is that when we have people on the street, usually what happens is the opposition goes down in the public polls. Why? Because in the same time, when people go to the streets, people who support them, they think in the anti-partisan way. And they invest all the expectations to the protesters. They think but the protesters cannot win election. The parties win election, okay? So when people go to the streets, opposition party are getting to be weak. Because what are the people talking about in the streets? Kaczynski is bad, but the liberal parties and the oppositional parties are so disappointing as well, okay? So they don't, this is a paradox, like we have to do something with this.
Thanks. Actually, let me start with what you mentioned as a paradox, because actually I don't think it's a paradox. I think it's a state of politics, and that state of politics in many of the countries in Western Europe and the Western Balkans is also not far away from that, actually has been there, is that the mainstream political parties have been simply bad, have been not delivering. So you have a democracy, and then inside the democracy, the key parties were supposed to deliver. Now, there are claims which are not about the delivery, but also there are legitimate issues that have been invoked that have been about delivery, and that was a failed delivery. And I think one of the issues, I think Slavomir, you pointed out the most vividly with the 500 zloty, with the social welfare system in Poland, is that actually, you know, guys, did you do it or you didn't do it? You had the choice. You had the money in your budget. You chose not to do it. So you have to live with the consequences. And I think one of the issues there is also to admit a mistake and then move on. Now, one of the things that Catherine mentioned is that there is a very essential problem in the way how politics is conducted today. You were talking about the are you basically, you know, are there rules that will allow me to admit a mistake and then rebuild? And I think what you're pointing out that there in these rules of politics, where actually everything is up for grabs, including the rules themselves, there is no space to admit mistakes. The second thing is as well the media cycle, because it went into very short-termism, and everybody is into winning the battle of the day, and very few will actually focus on the vision of the future. And actually, for that matter, some of those parties that we label as populists are